So good evening. Glad to have all of you here. This ought to be a fun event. I'm Perry Brown. I'm the Provost and Vice President for Academic Affairs. And this is the third of the Provost Distinguished Lectures for this fall. We have one more on December 3rd, I think it is. It's a Tuesday evening where we'll be doing some talking with one of our journalists here. But one of the things that we try to do with these lectures is to honor one of our faculty members that is doing some amazing work and has been honored for it, usually nationally or sometimes internationally, in one way or another. And you know, you get those accolades from people way outside of Montana, way outside of the University of Montana, and maybe it's kind of nice sometimes to honor them right at home. And so that's what we do with this series, is an opportunity to really take advantage of in a very positive way, to take advantage of those people we work with on a daily basis and really celebrate with them some of the accomplishments they've had and some of the amazing things that they do and the knowledge that they can share with us about some interesting topics that we have and we probably all can learn a lot from. So with that, I'm going to get off the podium here and ask Chris Comer, the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, to come forward and introduce our speaker for this evening. Chris?
Thank you, Perry. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here to introduce Kelly Dixon. Kelly is a friend, and she's an archaeologist. And looking at her documents, you can find out that she's especially interested in the American West, including, and this is a short list of her interests because they're vast, landscape transformations, human-environment interactions, boom towns, extractive industries, marginalized populations. Kelly's been very productive in the college. I know that because I pulled her personnel file today, and it's the thickest in our file cabinet. Lots of good stuff in there. She herself would describe her work this way, quote, transcending the nature-culture divide and understanding the ways in which humanity can navigate pressing issues relevant to our modern world. What you'll see from her work is that she's really interested in the archaeology of real life and its struggles. A partial list of her publications tells you something about some of the great things she's been up to and highlights one of her awards. Recently, she gave a paper, Archaeological Landscapes of Chinese Railroad Construction in the American West, and that paper is going to be talk is going to be turned into a paper quite soon. She has a book, The Archaeology of Desperation, exploring the Donner Party's Alder Creek Camp. That was a major academic publication and an award winner, national award winner. A Place of Recreation of Our Own, Archaeology of the Boston Saloon. That was a monograph. And then a little bit earlier, Boomtown Saloons, Archaeology and History in Virginia City. That was a major publication. If you go through her full list of publications, and that's just a tiny sampling, you'll find that her titles are often amazingly eye-catching and ear-catching, and actually sometimes quite an interesting literary turn to those titles. Outside her scholarship, the thing that I think is so impressive about her on so many levels is that she really integrates her research into her teaching. She teaches numerous field courses where she gets our students out into the field to really get their hands on materials and learn about the history of our region and others firsthand. Last year, you may know that she did a wonderful course where she had students investigate the history of the Missoula Underground and then made a presentation to the Missoula community on it. It was a really wonderful course. The sort of less interesting facts, but still relevant, let me just tell you that she got her BA at the University of Minnesota, her master's at Michigan Tech, and then she did her PhD in archaeology at the University of Nevada, Reno. And along the way, if you look in her file, there's lots of other interesting things, like, for example, and I didn't know this till I read the file today, a year studying Israeli and Palestinian culture. She joined our faculty in 2003, and I'm very pleased tonight to introduce her for her topic, Archaeology, Global Change, and the Modern World, Tales from the American West. Kelly?
thank you, everybody, for coming out tonight. Thank you for inviting me to do this lecture. It is quite an honor. I've been reminded of that by several other faculty on campus, so very pleased to be here. So, I think I'm going to start out by sharing an unresolved childhood issue I have with a publication that's about to come out. It's called Historical Archaeologies in the American West. The Journal of Archaeological Research will be publishing it in the next few months. And it went through 2 different reviews with 7 reviewers. And they keep telling me to cut it down. I had to cut out 10,000 words from this manuscript. And what I was asked to do is synthesize people who have done historical period archaeology in the American West. And so I looked at the work of all of my colleagues over roughly the last couple decades and tried to tell the whole story. And it ended up being too large of a manuscript for their journal, and I came to the conclusion that this is another book. This is my next book. I'm going to cull everything out. It's going to seem superficial in the publication, but I made myself feel better knowing that I could tell these stories in a book form. However, I started to realize that there's something important with the archaeology that's going on in the American West, especially over the past few centuries, because they tell this very important series of stories about human environmental interactions, buzzwords that are key to our current life in the modern world. And it occurred to me even more that all of these archaeologies have created an aggregate of information that can help us ask these grand questions about the world, and the other buzzwords like vulnerability, risk, adaptation, resilience, sustainability, you all have heard, but I wonder if you all have heard about the ways in which archaeology can actually inform and educate us on these topics, and maybe, just maybe, make the world a better place. So, I unfortunately only have about 45 minutes. Unless you guys want to stay till 10 p.m., ask lots of questions, I'm willing to stay. But I'm going to take you on a wild and crazy tour of the American West, a place and or a few artifacts at a time. Kind of like the history of the world in 100 objects, but University of Montana style. Some of the maps that are featured in this forthcoming paper I hope draw attention to the distinctions of what the West is, the North American West. The annual precipitation here gives you a great view of how once we hit the 98th meridian here just west of the Mississippi, things get relatively arid compared to the well-watered east. In addition, look at the public lands. Sorry, we didn't have the data for Mexico, but the darker the colors means the more the public lands. That means a lot of work for archaeologists due to cultural resource or archaeological resource laws. We have to do a lot of work on public lands. I also want to draw attention to the reservation lands. I hope you all can see this, and I'm sorry it's not easier to see because the reservations are relatively small compared with the lands that they used to have. They're all the small gray areas that you see here. So that's our grand setup for the story tonight. Now, I hate to do this to you with an ugly word slide, but I'm only going to hang out here for a couple seconds. I thought that it would be nice to define these so-called units of analysis that are powering the machine this evening. Vulnerability, risk, adaptation, resilience, and sustainability, and all of my sources. If anybody wants to come back to these units later, I'd be glad to put this nice boring slide up for you again during our question and answer period. Well, nobody gets out of this room tonight without knowing what archaeology is. So, in brief, it's the study of past human cultures and behavior, primarily through people's material remains. However, by the time I get done tonight, you'll also realize, I hope, that we are also interested in landscapes. Those are just as much a part of culture as the material remains themselves. The background photo is actually taken by one of our MA students who's now graduated, Ben Woody, when he went to Pompeii for a field school. Very quintessential archaeology. But to remind you all about where you are, this is a photo of some of our students, Mary Bobbitt and Dylan Kemp, dutifully working as part of the Historic Underground project with the archaeological survey class that took place this fall. So there are many types of archaeologies out there. And while you may have often thought of archaeology as being associated with the ancient and the exotic and perhaps people looking for the great mammoth hunters, there is this crazy group of us who have the luxury of using texts. Texts in the form of journals, diaries, photographs, maps. We also have oral histories available to us in some cases. And so this is where we divvy up these text-aided type archaeologists. There are Egyptologists and Mayanologists, and the Assyriologists are the people studying ancient Mesopotamia. The classical archaeologists are studying Greco-Roman sites. Sinologists are studying the Chinese. The medievalists are there, and then there we are. These historic sites archaeologists dealing with the relatively recent past and what has happened in the past 500 years or so since the so-called Age of Exploration. That's where my specialty fits in. In fact, as Dean Comer noted, my master's work was a Master of Science actually in industrial archaeology of all God-forsaken disciplines. Goodness gracious, nothing will make you look at the world more differently than a topic like that. Talk about unresolved childhood issues, I'll just leave it at that. So the watered-down definition of this type of archaeology addresses the last 500 years and addresses the spread of people from Europe, people from Asia, people from Africa, throughout the world, and of course the impact these people have had on the indigenous people of the world as they did their moving about, traveling, migrating, and such. I should probably pause to point out that a lot of the individuals over the past 500 years aren't often written up in detail in these texts that I was bragging about before. Whether they are Chinese workers on the railroad or whether they are Native Americans living on reservations, a lot of these stories aren't told in the level of detail perhaps that a lot of us would like in the historical records. And so the archaeology of this period gives us a chance to give pasts to these people without history, so to speak. Just to remind you of the Age of Exploration, there's our Age of Exploration map to think about the period when there was intensive exploration and mapping and colonization with direct contacts with people throughout the world. I'm sorry to do this to you guys. A lot of people think that the archaeology of the last 500 years is an archaeology of capitalism. There are page turners out there called archaeology of capitalism or Marxist archaeology. For a good time, you might want to check out those books. But indeed, the free market system of capitalism that tends to be exploited certainly underscores this period of archaeology, and so we can't look at the artifacts or the people or places without all of that baggage behind us. Equally, we can't forget that there was this precursor to capitalism that we call mercantilism. And this basically made policy to acquire colonies and control them in order to get power over raw materials. I'm sure this sounds familiar. I see people nodding. Welcome to your history lesson over the past few hundred years. One of my heroes in historical archaeology is a guy named Charles Orser. And he has a book that's about to come out that I had the good fortune to review called Modern World Archaeology. And he's trying to create yet another species of archaeology that sews together all of these isms and all of these issues. And he says, all right, if you're going to practice archaeology during this period, you got to be savvy. You have to know about the issues of colonialism and capitalism, racism and racialization and so on, because none of us can look at this period without considering all of those things. And what I really like, and this should make you all feel good, is that this was a time when everyone on Earth became part of this web of interconnectedness. Oh, yes. Welcome to the modern world. So amid all of this, I have started to kind of have a problem with some of my colleagues who keep emphasizing capitalism and colonialism. While I think those are great, this thing called the environment has gotten short shrift in the process. And that's a product of some of the theoretical advances and discussions that have been going on in the field, and I won't do that to you tonight, other than just let you know that it's there, but let you know that one of my mentors, Don Hardesty, who was my main professor at the University of Nevada, Reno, has done a lot of work related to global change archaeology. And this is where we can actually take all that we're learning about all this cultural baggage over the past few hundred years and actually do something that might help us better understand the contemporary environmental problems. Because surely those environmental problems must be linked with things like mercantilism and capitalism and racism and so on. Oh, I hope you don't feel like you're all being lectured at here, because you are. The theoretical foundations of the global change archaeology, as Don Hardesty and others promote it, has a basis in historical archaeology, studying landscape changes over time, transformations. My photos here take us right outside to Missoula. I'm sure many of you have seen this very famous photo that the K-Ross Tool Archives has on hand in their photo museum collection, showing teepees along the Clark Fork River. In fairly short amount of time, I'm showing you an excerpt here from a bird's eye view. Look at how the town is developing. That's 1884, how urban it is then. And then down below here, of course, I'm sure this is the Missoula that you all recognize today. So, what's going on in the background? Dare we become environmental determinists and talk about the last 500 years as also taking place during this thing called the Little Ice Age? I don't think we dare leave here tonight without you all thinking about this in terms of the Little Ice Age. The climate and global changes have certainly powered migrations, and there's a vast archaeological literature related to this. It's just intriguing to slow the narrative and look at that topic over the past few hundred years. And now I channel Ashley McCowan, who gave this talk a year ago, and she talked about her research at Jamestown and the skeletal remains that were found at Jamestown. And she underscored how the year of 1609, 1610 was a period of starvation where many people had to commit survival cannibalism in order to survive. And she was able to tell us a lot about those everyday lives of the people who were the original Jamestown colonists through the skeletal remains. Tonight I'm reminding you of this drought that arrived in the region. It was the driest conditions seen in the area for the last 800 years. Probably not a good time to show up and colonize a new landscape if you don't know much about it. Already you can see where the environmental information can help us better understand the nuances of what happened there. Which brings me to tale number one from the American West, a story of survival cannibalism, the Donner Party. This is why you guys all came here tonight. No. If I had a dime for every time I was asked to come and talk about the Donner Party at a banquet, I would be able to fund a postdoc position for somebody here. But I don't have time for the full campfire tale tonight. If somebody wants me to elaborate later, I sure will. I thought I would just show you the fateful trek that started out. The Donners themselves were from Springfield, Illinois. Like many others, during the spring and summer of 1846, they headed west. This was a little bit pre-Manifest Destiny. This was pre-California Gold Rush. These people were true pioneers, colonizing an unfamiliar landscape. What happened along the way is a long and arduous tale, but in short, they came to a sudden screeching halt here in the area that is today Truckee, California, where a mid-October early winter snowstorm stopped them dead in their tracks. They searched and searched to find cattle and oxen that were getting buried in the snowdrifts to no avail, and they went hungry fairly quickly and allegedly had to survive by cannibalizing the dead. What a lot of people don't know about this campfire tale is that there were actually two different camps. A larger part of the group made it to what is today Donner Lake and set up some cabins. The smaller group that included the Donner families, the captain of the Donner Party, for some reason, they were behind. In fact, what had happened on the trail is there was a breakdown in social cohesion, and one thing led to another, and the Donner Party split up, which was yet another problem that they faced. But archaeologically speaking, this means we have 2 Donner camps that we have to look at if we're going to study these people's risk and vulnerability and resilience to their situation. The work that our book is on took place at the Donner family's Alder Creek camp, a place where the issue of cannibalism was kind of sketchy. There were less survivors there, so we have less historical documents. The archaeology was really thought to clarify this story. And so Alder Creek today is quite a beautiful, picturesque place. You'd never know that such tragedy occurred there. But what we became very frustrated with was the fact that this story just didn't really consider what was going on out there in terms of these issues of survival and adaptation. People were just kind of interested in what they were eating. So we did find an archaeological record of what they were eating. And while the artifacts themselves really helped humanize the people who were out there and gave us a sense of the ambiance of the campsite, we have a collection of 16,000 bones, most of which are smaller than a human thumbnail. Hopefully you can get an idea from scale by looking at the paperclip in the upper portion of this photo. And the larger insets here are the largest bones that we've got. This is a centimeter scale. Take note, the one on the far right is a millimeter scale. And if you look at these, there are cut marks, there are chop marks. People are hyper-processing the heck out of these little tiny bones and boiling them down to nubbins to extract the grease. And what we found instead were evidence of glaring evidence of avoiding cannibalism. Because what were they eating? What were they eating? Gosh darn it. These 16,000 bone fragments are so crumbled and chewed up, we couldn't actually do DNA on them. The organic material was too degraded. So, thankfully, there are people out there who specialize in things like bone histology, looking at the microstructure of bones to try to identify species. Your quick lesson here, there's your bone. If you break down the bone and look at the cells, there are these things called osteons that the blood vessels run through. And at the microscopic level, these are fingerprints to species. And so for a small selection of the bones that weren't too degraded, we were able to try to tell what people were eating, and specifically using the bones that had all those processing marks on them. We couldn't get any humans in that story. This story of cannibalism, what? After all this work, we can't find humans? Many reasons probably why that I don't know if I have time to get into, but you can just see by looking at the diameter and the size of osteons, it's possible to identify species. I think the really interesting story is this one. It suggests that there was a dog, and in tacking back and forth between the historical records, it appears that the dog was the transition meal to cannibalism, that much like us today in our PetSmart world, the Victorians also had considered their dogs their close companions, and they were the last things to go into the kettles before the decisions were made to cannibalize the dead. So what we think happened is that cannibalism occurred after the first relief left. There were 4 relief parties who went in, and that it would have been less than a dozen people for 7 to 10 days. And looking at other examples of cannibalism in the archaeological record, if you didn't have to process them down to the bones, you wouldn't have to. This group of people wouldn't have had to process them down to the bones like they so desperately did their animals. So that's one important story. The other one here that comes from one of the chapters in the book. I should say that the book, which we're very glad it received an award, it's not just me. This is a group of many people working together, historians, bioarchaeologists, physical anthropologists who, in this chapter, Scott and McMurray's chapter, they talk about the timeline back to when Neanderthals walked the earth, that this contingency plan for survival cannibalism is something we're all equipped with. You just don't have to tap into it until you're that desperate. So there's a nice little lesson for you all. And if you want more details, well, there's the book, An Archaeology of Desperation. Have at it. Now, as far as where the bodies are, we can try to talk about that later. We've come to the conclusion that the acidic soils out there would have degraded any bone that wasn't thrown in the fire. And so if the human remains were treated differently than the animal remains, they may no longer be available out there. But to me, and in the context of tonight's conversation, it's this quote on the bottom that I think is important. The struggle for survival that was so different from the rural Midwest reminds us of an example of landscape learning and landscape learning as a part of colonization. Now, the thing is, there were other people who lived in the eastern Sierra Nevada when the Donner Party came through. Who might those have been? Oh, well, yes, the northern Washoe lived there, the Well-Melty. These are some snowshoes, like the type that they used. And in my conversations with people over the years, I came to realize with shock that an ethnography or oral interviews with Washoe elders passing on the stories that they heard about their first impressions of white settlers, which wasn't a very good set of first impressions, that they had stories to share. And that even though there were some 300 books and documentaries produced about the Donner Party, the ethnographies have never been used as a primary source. And so I think that's the most important chapter in this book, and telling all these other stories that we haven't heard before, right down to the places. All these numbers around the Donner campsites represent places that are important to the Well-Melty cultural heritage. In fact, they had village sites right nearby. In heavier winters, they went to lower elevations, but they were there. I'm showing you pictures of a camas field and camas bulbs because there's one story that we get from the historical record about how one of the gentlemen from the Donner Lake camp was approached by an Indian, and the Indian basically held his hand up like, stay back. And pulled something out of a backpack and was on some set of snowshoes and set these things on the ground. And they were tubers. And he said, oh, they were good. They tasted like sweet potatoes. And I always wondered, why would you have not followed the tracks in the snow? But, however, let's think of the era. People were afraid of the Indians as they were crossing the American West, and clearly there was something cultural going on there, but still, you'd think there would have been some better options to survival. And this is where I have to draw upon the work of some of my other colleagues that are looking at, wait a minute, why weren't people asking indigenous groups how they dealt with past landscape issues and water issues? That's kind of a good point. My goodness, why did colonizers tend to implement Western scientific knowledge over something that was already there? Gosh, if only the Donner Party had come around a couple hundred years later, they might have actually survived by talking to the locals. Very important lesson there. And that reminds me of the fact that these kinds of stories that we have that might seem like they're left field, they're stories about this period of transition, whether it's the transition of colonization or a transition that's even closer to home. And now I'm going to take you to the reservations. 2 reservations, specifically here in Montana, where I have to say, about a year ago, I would have never thought I would have this conversation with anyone. Our first example starts here on the Northern Cheyenne Reservation at Burney Day School Village, where we spent a week this summer as part of our field school, one of our field schools, documenting the reservation-era cabins. And we worked with MSU Billings, we worked with Chief Dullknife College, and basically they asked us, hey, can you come and help us with these cabins? We understand that you do this kind of archaeology. And I said, well, let's go on out there and see. But it got better, because we suddenly realized that we couldn't just document the cabins, but that we had to document the landscape. There was a lot more going on. And Chief Dullknife College has this great helium-powered blimp that they attach cameras to, so you can get nice aerial images that are better quality than Google Earth but so you can see things like, oh, look, there's the irrigation canal that nobody is using anymore that was put in during the BIA era, thinking that they could turn the Northern Cheyenne into farmers. We'll show them. We'll build them some log cabins and show them how to irrigate and farm, and away they went. The Google Earth image in the lower right just shows all the transects that they walked with their blimp. And then we ended up being able to take advantage of that and create a map that you see in the upper right-hand corner and start to compare that back and forth. This is the part of my talk where I have to draw attention to some grad students in the room. The real stars here, oh, they're sitting all throughout here tonight. They're among you, and I'm going to try to point them out whenever I can. But here is Erica Blecka. Erica comes to us from UC Berkeley, and she spent the summer trying to work on this map, but I'm going to pause for a minute. Erica's map, as you can see, is very cool, but what was going on in the background behind her was us working with basically the College of Technology at MSU Billings, so that what we could do was turn her map into a nice GPS version of a map, but how to document all these cabins when we only have a week. Well, there's this great thing called photogrammetry, where you can take photos from a few points and stitch them together and have a document better than you can imagine that could then be plugged into like a GIS overview map, and away we would go. So if only that's where the story stopped. Yes, it's a great way to teach students how to deal with the built resource, as we call it, structures. Great opportunity for a student like Erica, there she is outstanding in her field, to work with Northern Cheyenne elders to understand who lived where. Well, as we were visiting with the elders, and this often happens with oral histories, all of a sudden you go off topic. I'm the queen of going off topic as I look at the time. And what we found out was that they wanted to talk about water. And they told us how they were drinking water out of the Tongue River that's right nearby in the 1970s, as late as the 70s. And that when the BIA started setting up the town plan, they dug them these wells. See the nice little water spigot here? And how nice of them, but they never drank the water out of the wells. If they did, they got sick. And they said, this is like the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, way before the era of fracking. They were able to hold a flame to the outside of their water, and it would light on fire. And all I could think was, here we go again. I just want to document some cabins, and I can't get away from human environmental interactions and global change. Once again, we have another lesson. And this lesson goes farther. We're going to transition to the neighboring Absaloga Reservation. Many of you know as Crow. How did I do? Oh, okay, thanks. So a few years ago, a group of individuals looked at the home of Chief Plentycoo on the Crow Reservation, and they did an architectural analysis. And they noted how they looked at the overall landscape and layout, but if you look at the little log cabins compared with the teepee in the bottom, their architectural analysis indicated that people were still living in the cabins as if the layout was like a teepee. And instead of putting the chimney on, instead of putting the chimney on the side, the stove stayed in the middle, just like the heat source or the hearth would have been in the teepee. One among many interesting parallels to draw that I think Erica Blecka will have fun with as she works on her research trying to document the village at Bernie at Northern Cheyenne. And what's going to happen with the Absaloga? So yesterday morning in class, Marty Lopez, also in this room, can you give us a yes, there he is, reminded us of what he wants to do for his master's research. He wants to look even closer at this period of transition and look at the artifacts that have been recovered from the Second Crow Agency at Absaroka. This is a period 1875 to 1884, early issues with the reservation and the broken treaties, and I can't imagine what we're going to learn from Marty as he conducts his analysis to let us know even more the nuances of this period of transition. Lots of words, and I'm sorry to do this. It's just part of the setup for the next slide. Marty and Erica, I know, are not going to be able to avoid talking about landscape transformations and how people's traditional economy suddenly changed. Similarly, there are other archaeologists and historical ecologists looking at landscape transformations. I'm sure many of you have heard of the work of Al Crosby, where he was talking about how European introduced plant species in central Mexico was a process that took 300 years. Doesn't seem like a very long time. But he says, and I will quote here, "The magnitude of the change, good and bad, was almost greater than the mind could encompass or the heart endure. The metamorphosis was more than political or religious or intellectual or technological. It was biological." My colleague, Rebecca Allen, has done some work at mission sites in California. And if you can see here, there's a circular area that they're digging, and that's the location of where a house was. We can see them in context of this mission here. And she found, using information like macro-botanical remains that were in adobe bricks, but also from pollen analysis from soil samples in the houses, that it only took 70 years in coastal California for these kinds of transformations to take place. And it certainly had a profound effect on the native and the non-native population. Let's go to Missoula now with that in mind. Where are we? When we were getting a tour from the Missoula Historic Preservation Officer, Philip Meckling, before he retired as part of our underground project in Missoula, he talked about the history of Missoula. And he reminded us of how the Salish would come to the valley to harvest bitterroot. And it wasn't just up in the mountains where we look for it today, it was on the valley floor. And in fact, there was what would be considered a traditional cultural property in the area where Higgins turns into 39th. And the Salish were coming there to gather bitterroot up to the 50s and 60s, he said. I'm already looking to Sally to fact check me. Is that right? Okay. So here we are. That was the 50s and 60s. We're in that range now of just over 60 or 70 years where we too have witnessed these landscape documents. We're living with them. We're in that period of transition. I don't know what we're going to do about it yet. That's sort of what I want us all to think about as the night goes on and your lives go on. And I'm going to quickly go to our tale number 4 and take you to the urban underground. And as it's getting later in time, I told myself that I was going to have to stop with all the tales at some point. I probably have 10 to tell, and I'm not going to get to all them tonight, and that's okay. If you want, we can play Choose Your Own Adventure later, and we can go off on some of these. But our issue with Missoula, here we're looking at an 1884 bird's eye view, as it was called, of the Missoula Valley. Just to orient you, Mount Jumbo is over here. I'm going to be taking us into this downtown area fairly quickly. Started out with a class last year. The Fall Archaeological Survey class, and there are people in here, I'm glad you're here, Jeff McLean, because I'm going to talk about you, who signed up just thinking they were going to have a normal class, and this was the first experiment where we decided we'd answer the Historic Preservation Officer's request. Can you give me some facts about the underground? Everybody thinks it was like full of Chinese opium dens, which it wasn't. We're finding no evidence of that. Talk about myths in the Chinese. Give me 8 hours, and I'll talk to you about that. But while on the one hand it might look like we're running around with headlamps on and having a good time, but we're actually training students to go out and work with urban planners and work with environmentalists and work with developers to try to make sure that cultural and natural heritage is somehow preserved and dealt with as urbanization goes on. Missoula has 9 historic districts, as a by the way, and that's all I'll say about that. One of our great tools Hello, welcome to Historical Archaeology. We have these great fire insurance maps, 1884, 1888, 1890s, 1910s, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. We can look at the urban landscape and watch how it changed over time. And I've given you the link because, seriously, for a good time, I highly recommend this. I want to draw attention to this building here, and I'm going to tell you where we are. Here's Higgins. The bridge is right here. Here's Front Street. And normally, we would have like a nice Mexican restaurant there, or the Hammond Building. It's not there yet. If we look at the close-up of the bird's eye view that I've excerpted, here's this building, and I couldn't help. This is dedicated to you, Nikki Manning, who is doing her master's thesis on the Missoula Historic Underground and all the urban archaeology associated with it. Look how accurate this drawing is in comparison with what you can see from the building plan there. I think those bird's eye view artists were right on. And so the key with archaeology is multiple lines of evidence. Yeah, you got a photo. It's nice if it's backed up by a map. It's nice if it's backed up by oral history, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things that happened in last fall's survey class was we had the opportunity to explore the Top Hat before they did their renovations on it. We've zoomed in now on the area where the Top Hat is on the 1888 Sanborn. Jeff McLean, Jeff, hi, didn't know he was going to get picked on tonight, found out where the imprint would have been for the building that is now the Top Hat. And look at this, you guys. I don't know if you can all read that. It says underground liquor cellar. Well, that's sure intriguing. We're going to come back to that in a minute. So in the basement of the Top Hat, before it got all nice and looks like it is now, and it was the Top Hat, I say that as if I went there all the time, and I never went there before this project, so I'm not that cool. But here is Jeff working on making a plan map, because our job is to teach these students how to make plan maps for the world of preservation. And Nicole Garr, the previous owner, pointed out this thing on the floor, and she said, look, if you move this trap door, there was a switch. And my dad told me that during the Prohibition era, that opened up a secret door below. And so, of course, the students all wanted to knock out the wall, and they actually got their wish, because the new owner ripped out that wall in the basement and was going to do some work there. Well, what clever Jeff McLean did amid all this is here he lined up his rough sketch map here with the Sanborn and said, well, if there was a door, it would be right about there. Here's his cleaned up one, and that door is right here. That's what it looks like from the outside after they excavated with heavy equipment. I don't know why. They didn't let us come in with dental picks to work on it for 3 years. I don't know why. And this, oops. And this is the door on the inside. So it was a great adventure among many. I don't have time to tell you all of the stories of the Missoula Underground tonight, but the good news is that the Nikki Manning can. She's in our master's program. She is taking on the underground as her thesis. She gives a lot of public lectures. In fact, if you've been to any of her First Friday events, there's like 500 people who show up, and we're not kidding. So you'll have other opportunities. Oh, yes. In addition to finding adaptations during the Prohibition era, we also found adaptations related to risk preparedness. In the basements of some of our buildings in Missoula, there's remnants of Cold War stashing and fallout shelters, basically. Here are the students out and doing their thing, but if you look here, this has a date of 1963, and it says carbohydrate supplement. So Armageddon plans are happening. I'm not really kidding either. Spaces in the underground. Good luck with all that. We had a GIS student, Jared Fisher, who started digitizing all the Sanborns so that they could be linked with modern locations, and we could look at all of them over time. Wonderful project. And I'm going to wrap up with the end of this tale by reminding you all that this is an urban ecosystem along a river ecosystem, and that if we think of Missoula as being a place where people and the rivers interact, we actually can learn even more about adaptation, sustainability, and the like. So what a lot of people don't realize is that Missoula never started out right here where it is downtown. It was a trading post that was out along Mullen Road. And in order to be the town that it was, Missoula needed to have a flour mill and a lumber mill. And the water coming from Grant Creek on that side of town did not provide enough power for the mill race. So they moved it where it was because Rattlesnake Creek was the next closest creek that had the water power for a mill race. Great story, yes, yes, and there's the mill. Sat right here, we can see it on the Sanborn, and there is the mill race on the Sanborn. Now the interesting thing is here it looks like it goes beneath a building, and that's because it does. That's the trailhead today. It was the historic, the Missoula Mercantile, while it had its main office here, it had to start to spread out, and it used this as a warehouse. And they needed the mill race when they constructed that warehouse, so they left the mill race intact. If you go in there today, you can see the arch from the mill race. That's actually a view and then close up from the outside. But they took advantage of it. They used the arch as structural support for the building, and then the mill race could still flow underneath. How cool. What a great lesson to learn from the underground adventures. Panning back, this is just another view. This shows our mill in operation, the 5-story Hammond. Look how urban this is. And this, we're looking at an 1891 bird's eye view, which I've zoomed in on. But now I want to show you guys how complex the Rattlesnake Creek is when you look at this, where it fed into the Missoula River. And this is where I switch and start to remind you all that I've been sitting in, going to some of the Institute on Ecosystems talks and conferences, and I've learned things where the people from the harder and natural sciences are saying things like, there's complexity at confluences. And then I suddenly realized they're not talking about humans. And then I suddenly realized that how are they accounting for all the human selection in all of their research, especially when we know things like this? Oh dear, we've got to learn more about this. But I can't do it alone because I am not that kind of a scientist. This is a paper that Nancy Grimm and colleagues wrote on urban ecosystems. And I started trying to learn what the urban ecologists are all about, and it suddenly hit me, and this is where I pulled the quote from their paper, that no more has this human intense participation and transformation been more visible than in cities. And urban areas account for only 2% of Earth's land surface, but they produce 78% of greenhouse gases. We need to slow the narrative and do more urban archaeology, especially in places like Missoula where our water still is apparently clean. Let's think about that. Now, thankfully, there are other people in other disciplines and across other Montana institutions who can help out. And we have a working hypothesis here that starts with 10,000 years ago, and the anthropogenic complexity obviously gets more complex here about 100 years ago, whereas the ecological complexity gets less. And so we are about to test this hypothesis to talk about how human development has historically shaped the environment. And our colleagues, Maury Vallette and his postdoc, Mark Papak, are looking at the ecological response variables, and they're looking at flood records and time series analysis of discharge. Meanwhile, to look at the human response variables, or the anthropogenic variables, we have things like historic maps of the steam tunnel system that ran underground that suddenly to us become evidence where we could look at total pipe length. We could combine that with population through some of Jared's maps, water demand, irrigation, and we could actually be systematic about charting these changes. And so we're literally in the early conversation phase of this right now. Mary Bobbitt, hi Mary, is doing some research related to this to try to put together the pieces of here's Mary, of what happened in the past 10,000 years, but specifically what might the pre-settlement vegetation have been like. She's going through things like the General Land Office records that give us a snapshot of pre-settlement vegetation. It's going to be a wonderful time. So I am leaving you with a quote, even though I probably have 80 more slides. I'm leaving you with a quote here. This was stopping point number 1. from a book that is called The Archaeology of Global Change. And they remind us that if we're going to have useful information, we need to transcend this nature-culture divide that seems to have been so prominent in many of our disciplines. And we need to transcend that by making sure we include traditional ecological knowledge accompanying Western science so that we can make better decisions about where we're going in the future. But it's essential to see that this is rooted in the way people's productive strategies, social institutions, and the environment have co-evolved. And I would love to keep talking, so I'm going to just stop there so that I can honor my promise that I would be done by about 1:45, and I would be thrilled to entertain questions from you all. Specifically, if somebody wants to ask a question about Chinese railroads, that will allow me to segue to some of the artifacts that are over there. And before I open it up for questions, I do want to remind you that we have brought for you tonight, we meaning the wonderful students lined up over there, have brought some artifacts from our museum collections, and artifacts that represent these past few centuries. And when you all are released tonight, as you mosey out to the reception, please go look at the artifacts. Ask them about these. We are proud of our museum collections here, and we're very grateful. Thank you for support that you all have given us over the years to get to where we are now. I'm stopping. Thanks.
There's one way over there.
Oh, Paylin. Yeah. Hi.
Hi. I've actually been doing a little bit of research into Missoula in the 1920s, excuse me, associated with a diary that I found in an antique store. And one of the things I've noticed is that unlike today, Missoula probably prior to the 30s was a pretty diverse place. And basically, I've been able to find where you can really see the diversity is unfortunately in the record of hangings in this town. Very few white people ever hang in this town. So I was wondering if you have been able to sort of tease apart how the different ethnicities sort of play into, excuse me, some of these transformations that are going on in the 1880s and maybe the 20s and 30s.
That is a wonderful question. And I've got to say, as I begin to answer that question, it sounds like here tonight I'm one of those environmental archaeologists. And I'm kind of an everything archaeologist. And my book, Boomtown Saloons, was about exactly that issue. It was about the way to look at saloons as a lens to look at the multicultural West. My dissertation project excavated an African-American saloon. We compared that with 2 Irish-owned saloons and a German opera house saloon. And of course, really what we got from either Hollywood or the documents that was that, you were going to a saloon seeking certain death. And that's just what it was. It wasn't about recreation. But what we found was that it seemed like the saloons pluralized the multicultural West instead of making it a melting pot, and that there was a saloon for African Americans, and there were saloons where the poor Irish went, and there were saloons where the rich people went. And the archaeological record of those saloons told an even better story. For example, at the African American saloon, we had a number of faunal remains, animal bones, that told us some of the meals that were eaten there. Of course, we had some glassware and bottles, things you'd expect. But when we compared those with the glassware and the faunal remains from the other saloons, the African American owned saloon was more on par with the Opera House saloon than it was the Irish saloons. And that snapshot alone made us all rethink the issues of multiculturalism in the West. When you layer in, and this was Virginia City, Nevada, when you layer in the fact that the Northern Paiute people had lived in Virginia City, Nevada since time immemorial, all of a sudden they lost all their pinyon pine because all of the trees were necessary for building the mining town, so much so that when they deforested that area, they had to go get the wood from the lake, or from the forest around Tahoe. And so all of a sudden, and to do that, that meant there were Chinese workers up in the Tahoe area working there to get the wood to send back to the Comstock mining district. Meanwhile, there was a wood choppers war where people didn't want people to hire the Chinese, and they went after the Chinese. And this string could go on and on and on with examples. And I'm glad you asked that question. It almost gives me an opportunity to talk about Chinese railroad workers, but I'll wait. Okay? Yes.
What about those Chinese railroad?
Oh my gosh. Okay. What a wonderful question. I don't know why you would have asked that. Okay. So we're going to start out by reminding you all of this thing with the railroad. As we zoom in here on our 1884 bird's eye view, I want you to take note. There are 4 trains in town at this time. We think it's bad now. Oh my goodness. This is just a microcosm. And that makes me want to tell you all that we have got to look at the ways railroads as vectors for biological agents, for information, transformed and impacted the environment. And about a month ago, I was invited to Stanford to talk about this topic of Chinese railroad workers. And we could certainly look at, I've got a view of the Missouri Rivershed here, whether railroad or river, all these transportation corridors really need to be considered when we're looking at the colonization of the West and thinking about vulnerability, risk adaptation, and so on. But I, for several years, have been working on some of these remote Chinese sites, whether logging camps supplying railroads or whether working with the grad students like Chris Merritt, who did his doctoral dissertation on the Chinese in Montana. And as part of that dissertation, he looked at a few railroad sites. I'm going to read you guys something. I know everybody just wants to go home, and now I'm going to start reading. It doesn't bode well for you. But I want to draw attention to some of the Chinese artifacts. This is a spouted jar, often held soy sauce. These are some rice bowls turned upside down. In working at various sites, various multicultural sites in the West, I have learned, as have others, that many of the sites inhabited by Chinese have a very distinct signature because they were continuing to use a lot of these products. And if we look over there at Amy's womaning the table right now with artifacts. Amy, would you mind holding up the spouted jar for the group? When you guys go over there, I want you to take a look at that and note how it didn't come out intact. Archaeologists don't really find things intact. The bottle hunters do. We find things in fragments and glue them together. And so these artifacts are a bridge to the past. They help us understand who was there, what they were doing. But when we think about landscape transformation in the American West and just look at this photo and look at those people in that photo for scale, and now allow me to read a description to you that will hopefully make you all feel like you're standing in front of the line of railroad workers coming your way. For more than 20 miles, workmen are seen digging, chopping, lifting, blasting, cursing, and shouting. Trees are crashing down. Earth is flying from countless shovels, and huge rocks are being riven and scattered from all sides. Men, hundreds in a gang, proceed to mow down the forest. The trees are felled with surprising rapidity, and a broad swath, 200 feet wide, is opened up through the forest. And now come thousands of Chinese laborers to level the earth. Can you imagine? I always wondered what it was like to be there, and when I was at Stanford last month, I brought this up as, wow, there's some environmental implications here. And they said, I don't think so. I'm not sure I buy that, Kelly. Really, it was just that narrow corridor. And I said, whoa, hang on. Yeah, narrow corridor. I don't know where I put my remote. Narrow corridor, right. But when you look at the extent of the transcontinentals, they were everywhere. And I actually had Diane Whited add in the annual rainfall and rivers to this so we could start to think about this topic together. And yesterday, was that during Marty or Aaron's presentation? It was Marty's presentation where he was describing the railroad coming onto the Crow Reservation and how somebody was so upset I'm not going to quote it properly, Marty, you might have to help me, that if they cut down any trees, that he was going to stab them, and he pulled out his knife. And to me, that was like the answer I'd been looking for. Yes! Yes, there was massive environmental change, and the indigenous people did think something of it. Imagine that story if we were to put that together. But the story of the Chinese is a fun one. And right up yonder in the northwestern part of the state, along the Clark Fork River, is a section of what was the Northern Pacific Railroad. And thanks to Chris Merritt's research and a retired railroad employee, Gary Weiss, who we gave authorship to on this paper, we understand the artifacts that were at these sites. We understand where they are. Eric Carlson, who was a former master's student in our program, did this great artistic rendition because there's a paucity of documents about these thousands of Chinese laborers who built the West, so to speak. I think I could maybe count on two hands the historic photos that are available. And the people at Stanford of all places, were lamenting the fact, American studies researchers, historians of Chinese and Chinese American studies saying how frustrated they were that they couldn't find one journal or one diary that was penned by one of the Chinese workers. And of course, all of us archaeologists couldn't get over that. No, it's got to be somewhere. How can you not find these? And no, in Montana, we have it written in stone, thanks to another student in our program. This is Knight of UM students. Tim Urbaniak, who is in our PhD program, is taking on the study of historic inscriptions as his doctoral dissertation topic, noting that they aren't quite rock art, they're something else. But when he found out I was going to Stanford, we had this conversation, and he said, oh, I've got Chinese writing on the sandstone cliffs. I'm pretty sure it was associated with the Northern Pacific extent in Billings. Well, how exciting is that? So I got to go to Stanford, and while all these people cried about not having anything, and show this slide, and Tim is out there recording the site now, and Stanford wants us to write a paper on it, but also I want to add to that paper that not just think about the rock art and the artifacts, but actually do connect that with the bigger issues of human-environment relations, and think on this level about not only railroads then, but now, and can we use the past as prologue in Detroit and learn more about not only the Chinese, but about how we might find a sustainable future, as a lot of us deal, and especially in this town, with a future based on railroads. That's a whole other topic. Sorry. Any other questions?
We have another one before we break? Well, why don't you join with me and thanks Kelly again. This is
Glad you enjoyed it.